G. Edward Griffin is an author of a book that sounds like fiction, and I wish it was, but it's not. It's The Creature from Jekyll Island. It is probably the quintessential, not probably, it is the quintessential book on the Fed. I mean, unless it was written by the Fed itself, and then it's a totally different story. That one is the one that they would tell would be much more of a happy, wholesome, all-American story. I think the Fed is a dangerous, dangerous institution that is out of control. Shouldn't have happened in the first place. And it's not just our Fed, it's the central banks all over the world that are actually controlling what's happening to our money. And G. Edward Griffin is here with us now. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Glenn.
Tell me, you know, your book deals with the history, and I don't want to get into the history as much as they are printing money now, digitizing money, even though Bernanke said, we'll never do that. We'll never do that. They have. We all know this is a sham. Everybody in their heart of hearts knows it ain't going to last. How do we reverse this? Or can you reverse this?
Well, it can be reversed quite easily. The Federal Reserve System was created by an act of Congress, and that law is still on the books. Any act of Congress can be rescinded by Congress. So it's a simple matter to abolish the Fed.
Okay.
But you have to have a resolve on the part of those congressmen to do so, and that's where the problem lies.
Well, everybody seems to think, I mean, they don't understand Jefferson was against the Fed. Our founders were against the Fed. Hamilton, who also wanted to go back to a monarchy, he would have been totally cool with the Fed. But they will all tell you that we have to have the Fed. They're all schooled into this now, that we have to have it.
Well, right, of course. They're schooled in it, and that, of course, is the answer. I think for the average person to get a handle on that, they have to understand what the Fed is. Do we have to have a cartel running our government? Do we have to have a cartel printing our money? And that word cartel rings somewhat strangely in the air, because most people think the Federal Reserve is an agency of the federal government, when in fact it's no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. It's a banking cartel that they succeeded in getting a monopoly, a legalized monopoly, on the issuance of the nation's money. And once you get a handle on that, it's so overwhelming to realize that it's alien, totally alien and foreign to our concept of the American way and our government, what people think our government is, that then it becomes very easy to say, well, we have to get rid of it. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we have to do it, so let's start.
Well, I think we have to get rid of it. And nobody would put up with an agency in our own government that is telling us how to drill for oil, how to make cars more efficient, and controlling all of our energy, if it was actually Exxon and Shell,
exactly, yeah,
just under the Federal Oil Reserve. They're companies, and that's what most people don't understand. The Federal Reserve is a collection of companies, correct?
That's right.
And it's so secretive, we don't even know what companies.
Well, it's not really so secret. It's there if you want to dig, but the companies themselves are not important. It's the fact that it's a conglomerate. It's a cartel. What countries really control OPEC, for example? Well, they all do. They're all part of it. The bigger countries have the more dominance and so forth. So within the banking fraternity, the larger banks have more clout than the smaller banks. But the names of the banks are not too important. It's the fact that it's a bankers' union. It's a bankers' association, and they're running their own regulations.
And how does it work internationally? Because we're sending money over. A lot of the stuff people don't realize, the stimulus money that we put in and the money that we gave on TARP, a lot of that went overseas.
Well, huge amount of it.
Huge amounts. How are they connected to the overseas banks?
Well, that is almost a philosophical question, because you have to go back to its origin, which I know we're not going to do today. But historically, the central banks of the world have sort of come together and it's like an international fraternity.
Right.
The banking fraternity is perhaps a fairly accurate description. They work together, they meet together, they have a technical focal point in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank of International Settlements, and they meet there constantly. You don't read about that in the newspapers, but the heads of the banks and their second lieutenants are always going there and meeting and scheming and putting things together. And so about 20 or 30 years ago, the international banking community was really one. It was never solidified, as far as I'm aware, in some kind of a piece of international legislation or a formal contract or anything, but it just developed, and it is. So nobody moves in any central bank without consulting with and getting the consensus, more or less, of the other central banks. And of course, the United States is the big player still at the moment in that, and so it's the tail that wags the dog.
Do you believe that it is a, I'll give you an easy way out. I believe that while there probably are some very nefarious people, for the most part, there are people that are involved that grow arrogant who think, well, we've got a system, and this just works better. And so I know him, and he knows me, and we're just trying to, look, you don't understand, you little people. You don't understand how it all works. And so they're just doing what they feel is best for everybody. Do you feel it's...
I think those two elements go hand in hand, yes. Certainly, nobody wants to go to work every day thinking, how am I going to mess up the economy today?
Right.
You know, they have to think that they're doing something positive. And the fact that in the process of doing so, they happen to make a lot of money and have a lot of power,
sure.
Well, that's nice, but certainly that's not their primary motivation.
Right. And it's a lot like the central bank in Germany. When the central bank in Germany, what their motivation was to start printing. Some people say it was to print money to screw the Allies and the rest of the world. Others were to say, well, they hoped that it would change and it would just get better somehow magically. It really doesn't matter what their motivation was. It doesn't work.
No, and the fact is that there's so much profit motive for the individuals who have their hands on these levers of power. It's just so tempting that I think you'd have to be an alien from another planet to resist that kind of temptation to be corrupted.
Real quick, I don't hear a lot of talk about abolish the Fed anymore. Is there a real effort to abolish the Fed that you think would work, that people should be aware of?
Well, I think the effort is not as well organized as it should be. Of course, we're trying to do something about that. We saw a lot of abolish the Fed energy during the political campaigns, of course, primarily focused around the campaign of Congressman Paul. Because all of these rallies brought the Federal Reserve into the focal point. So abolish the Fed was the obvious answer to that issue. Well, now that the elections are over, that's cooled down. You don't hear much about it. But those people are still there, and the numbers are growing. The energy in it is still building, and I expect that one of these days, again, perhaps during the next election, we'll see it come to the surface again. It gets stronger and stronger each time it comes to the surface.
Well, I will tell you that I hope that it doesn't have to wait until the next election, because I'm not sure how many more elections we have before we have to change the currency and change the system. If you have not read this book, you should. It is the definitive book on what the Fed really is and how it was birthed. And once you learn what the Fed is, you don't want anything to do with the Fed. The Creature from Jekyll Island, available everywhere. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
God bless. We're going to spend a couple of extra minutes with the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. When I first saw this book a few years back, I remember thinking, that's some sort of fiction, it's a science fiction book, and I kind of wish it was. Jekyll Island was just an island where the rich and powerful could meet back in the day, turn of the century. Explain how this came to be, the Fed.
Well, first of all, I did have a lot of fun creating that title, The Creature from Jekyll Island, because it sounded like if somebody saw it, they'd say, oh, a sequel to Jurassic Park, or something like that. But no, Jekyll Island is a real island, and it's significant because, as you mentioned, it's where the Federal Reserve was created. It's on Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Georgia. And back in 1910, when all this action started, that island was privately owned by a small group of billionaires from New York. People like J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, and their business associates. It was a resort island where their families went to spend the cold winter months to get out of New York. So these people went there, the founders of the Federal Reserve went to that private island, a very luxurious clubhouse there, to create the Fed because they wanted to stay out of the public eye. They were doing something which, had the public known about it, or had the press picked up on it and publicized it, would have raised a lot of questions that they didn't want to answer.
It had already been rejected.
Well, the idea had been rejected, yes.
Over and over again.
Over and again. And so the American people and Congress had said, no, we don't want a central bank, which is kind of a code name for a partnership between government and private banks to print the money for the nation and so forth. That's what they already had in Europe. That's what they had at the Bank of England. And the American people said, no, we don't want that. We're America, we want our own institution. And so these guys had to figure out a way to create a central bank, which they already knew people didn't want, and not to call it a central bank, and how to sell it.
That's why it's the Federal Reserve.
That's why they call it the Federal Reserve.
And they decided how to print money, how to make money just appear.
Yeah, they had to disconnect money from something that limited the supply of money, and that was gold. As long as money is backed by gold or silver, you can't just have all the money you want. You've got to have the gold and silver first. So it's a break on how much money can be put into existence. Well, you see, again, if you're a banker, think about that. How does a banker make a profit? By lending money. So if your inventory is limited, if your money inventory is limited, your profits are limited. So the bankers wanted to release that break so they could lend more and more and more money. Didn't have to get it from gold or silver. They could just create it.
They'll say that the kind version of this is they will say that the United States would have boom and bust periods about every 20 years. And you go back and you look at it. It is about every 20 years. They said they were going to stop all of that, which they don't. In fact, they get worse because they create bubbles.
Well, it's true. There were some boom and bust cycles in the United States, but if you really look at them analytically, it's because the very system they created was already in existence at the state level. It just hadn't been federalized yet. Well, the state banks were creating money out of nothing. There were booms and busts at the state level every time the bubble would burst. And so they came along then in 1913 when the bill was enacted. They said, we don't want any more of these booms and busts, so let's take the system that was causing the booms and busts and federalize it, and we'll make it apply to the whole nation.
Because it's arrogance. Really, arrogance. It is. It's arrogance.
Yeah. So they did solve the problem somewhat, but they merely pushed it off into the future and made it bigger, and now we're suffering the consequences.
And that's why the Federal Reserve was behind really the bailouts, because we say no bailouts for the big banks. Well, the Treasury answers to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is the big banks.
The Federal Reserve is the big banks. That's
right.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So since the Federal Reserve is basically making the decisions, and we realize that the Federal Reserve is a banking cartel, now we realize that the banking cartel is making the decisions to bail itself out with money that it creates on behalf of the American people. It's a total scam. It's a legalized plunder of the American people. And the only way they get away with it is because the average American doesn't understand how it works.
The name of the book is The Creature from Jekyll Island, available everywhere. Read it and you'll run from the Federal Reserve. Thanks. From New York, good night, America.